Around 1,500 protesters in Thailand have broken through barriers around the King's residence in Bangkok. Police have used water cannon to push them back. Now they're demanding the resignation of the government and reform of the monarchy. It's the latest in a series of protests that began last July. Let's get more on this from Bangkok. Tony Cheng, our correspondent, is monitoring events for us. Dramatic scenes outside the royal palace. Tony, what seems to have instigated them?
Well, indeed, but in the last 15 minutes or so, the police have actually pushed back and very quickly pushed the protesters away. So it looks for now as if things have settled and most of the protesters have dispersed. But it did get quite fiery about an hour ago. In preparation of this protest, the police had built an enormous barricade across this open ground, which is not actually the King's residence. It's the ceremonial Grand Palace. The King's residence is actually elsewhere. Nonetheless, it is of huge significance to the monarchy here in Thailand, and the protesters had been told very explicitly that they could not approach, in addition to which this barrier of containers had been put right across the road, which appeared to have stopped them in their tracks. They, however, rather enterprisingly, using ropes, pulled two of these containers away, which left them at a standoff with the police. The police fired water cannon and then charged against them, also firing tear gas, and appear to have pushed them off. Nonetheless, I think this is a sign once again that these protests have bubbled up. Now, it's, I think, important to note here that the protesters were far outnumbered by the police, about 1,500 protesters. We think that more than 3,000 riot police were deployed. We're not seeing the kinds of numbers in the protesters' ranks that we were seeing towards the end of last year, when we were seeing tens of thousands of people coming out. Very difficult at this stage to gauge whether the sting has gone out of the protests, but there is an awful lot of unhappiness amongst the protesters and elsewhere. That the protest leaders have been arrested, currently awaiting charges of lèse majesté, of insulting the monarchy, which are being fairly freely handed out at the moment in Thailand, particularly against the protesters. But I think also that the government has really made no substantive efforts to look at reforming the constitution, and that the administration that they were so unhappy about is still very much in place.
Well, that's the background to exactly what's happening. In terms of where we are, in terms of the ceremonial ground, Tony, for those of us that have been to Bangkok, it is a vast area to police. It would be difficult for any security force to police such a large venue. However, it does beg the question that how a small number of protesters has managed not just to get so close to this ceremonial location, but to break through barriers and really upset the status quo. That's quite a worry.
It is, but I think we've seen this again and again. The police have been putting up these enormous barricades and just sitting back and waiting. In this instance, it was also quite easy for them to push back, because while the protesters had broken through two of these shipping containers, it did effectively bottleneck them. They then there was a standoff of about 20 minutes where they were throwing fireworks and some bottles at the police, but the police were able to stay well back. And when they chose, they moved the water cannon forward and they themselves charged through. I think what we are seeing at the moment is a much hardened attitude from the police. It was here on this royal sort of park, I guess you would call it, that we saw the police really going very heavily against the protesters, and they have been much tougher in the past couple of months than we saw last year. I think the authorities have taken the decision that while the numbers of the protesters seem to be considerably diminished, they're going to increase the severity with which they punish the protesters. They were broadcasting messages saying anyone arrested could potentially face 2 years in prison and a fine of several $1,000s. They reminded the protesters they were not only not allowed to get close to the Grand Palace, but they were also breaking COVID regulations which ban gatherings, large gatherings of people. So they are taking a more severe attitude, and I think what they've done this evening is an illustration of that.
Indeed, certainly one to watch in the coming hours. Tony Cheng for us there in Bangkok. Thank you.